And here we go. We have Mark Erdmann on the line. Thanks, Mark, for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Welcome back. You are the first person who's been on the podcast and now on the live show.
Yes,
first two-timer.
Yes, we had a different guest, but we still didn't have anyone from the conservation community and scientific world. So it's great to have you over here. We have a few questions that we want to ask. And why don't we jump right into it?
Well,
I think.
Before we jump into that, you're in New Zealand. Yeah? You're in Auckland.
I am in Auckland, locked down.
Yeah.
Another week.
How is it there? I mean, are you guys free to walk around and go do some exercise, or is it a proper lockdown?
Yeah. Well, it's a lockdown, but you're allowed to go out to get exercise kind of within your neighborhood. You're not supposed to beyond your neighborhood, and you're allowed to go get essential services, be that food or petrol or pharmaceuticals. But yeah, it is pretty locked down. We're not allowed to go in the water, actually, which is, my gills are drying out.
Yeah.
But that changes next Tuesday.
Cold water there. Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday.
Wow.
Okay, that's good. That's good news. And well, we know you quite well, so we know that you are on the road pretty much very, very often. And this is probably the first time that you spend all this time at home.
Yeah, this is actually the longest period of time I've spent in New Zealand since moving here 6 years ago.
Wow.
So,
okay.
It's good for family, but as I say, my gills are drying out. I'm getting antsy.
Yeah.
Were you in New Zealand when they said we're closing the borders, or were you somewhere else and you had to get back quickly?
No, I actually was here, and I had a number of trips to Indonesia, actually to Raja Ampat planned, which we immediately saw, look, we know where this is probably going to go. And in discussions, there were actually donor trips, and it became clear that it would be very dangerous to be on the middle of the ocean during that time frame.
Yeah.
Locked out.
Yeah. That was during, I was supposed to go to Raja also with a group of from England, and they turned around in Qatar or something, on Dubai. They went back because they were recalling everyone. Basically, every country was recalling everyone. And definitely the last place where you wanted to be quarantine was on a boat that you don't know if you can access any harbor or something like that.
With the closing Sarong.
Yeah. Right. So now diving is not happening. And so one of our concerns, as we know, for instance, very well, and we live in a developing country, is that we saw that in the past, that if you don't have a presence on those reefs to protect them, you start to get maybe illegal fishing or something like that. Did you hear any reports about the possibility of illegal fishing happening in marine protected area in Indonesia, that we have quite few?
Unfortunately, yes. My inbox is flooding every day right now with such reports, and it's very concerning. Quite frankly, it's a disaster in the making. So, I think what we're seeing, I think this is probably true across the planet. Quite frankly, if those of us that are sitting in developed countries and monitoring social media, we see all these nice memes and poems going around about how nature is breathing again, and we have such reduced emissions, and wildlife is moving around freely across highways and into backyards. And I think that is probably quite true in most developed nations, especially where we're more of a service economy and they're hunkered down in their house. But I think that it's a very bimodal response across the planet. And if you look in most developing nations where people are truly dependent upon natural resources, this whole situation is actually really bad for nature. Nature's not breathing. Nature is either being raped or being degraded.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what we're go ahead.
Sorry, what we're seeing, for instance, here in Bali, like we saw, let's say, different sort of response, and I think also was quite natural. Is let's say in the Western world, what we did and still happening, like you see, like people that they have money and they go stockpiling, and they go inside the supermarkets and empty the shelves like that. And I think they had also a reaction over here, let's say locally, and they said, from one day to the other, I start to do not have any more a revenue, like in a place like Bali, which comes mostly from tourism. And so they needed to stockpile, and they started to go fishing, So we have a sea full of fish around here in Indonesia. So they rely on that.
Mm.
And so we are now in a situation in which we think like, okay, yeah, like you're saying, it's not really like the picture with that which we're trying to show out there.
Yeah.
But on the other
And I
hand,
think,
well, if you want to make changes, I guess it's good that we give this sense of hope to the people, of let's say the Western world, that we can actually make. There must be some benefits by not having this crowd in the nature, right?
sure, sure, without question. But I think coming back for a second to what you were saying about the situation in Bali, I think that from what I can gather, if I take all of the information coming into my inbox every day, there's really two things that are happening in developing nations. The first is what you've just referred to, which is, quite frankly, it's an innocent response that's just plain tragic, which is that you have communities that were deriving good livings from tourism, uh, where that tourism has now collapsed, and the only supermarket that they can go and stockpile from is the reef in front of their house or the forest behind their home. And you're seeing communities now doing that, right? So the reefs are getting hammered. If it's a terrestrial situation, they're going and hunting for the animals in their backyard. That's one thing, and that's certainly a tragedy. And I think you're seeing that across the developing world. But an even more sinister issue, which is, I think, what is most setting me on edge right now, is that there's a lot of bad guys out there who recognize that this is the most incredible opportunity to target protected areas, so MPAs or terrestrial protected areas, and or protected species, because there's no tourists out there, there's no eyes on the reef or eyes in the forest, and quite frankly, quite a few of the patrols are shut down. They're shut down either because it was tourism revenues that allowed those patrols to happen, or they might even be under shelter in place rules themselves, and not actually able to go out and do things. And that is probably the one which is most concerning to me. We have an example, Rajampat, of course, is a place that I know very well, and I'm quite connected to the situation there. And there are big boats that are coming in, and they're trying to target the top dive sites, which are in the middle of, no-take areas where there's not supposed to be any fishing. And that's not, kind of a innocent, oh, we just need to put some food on the table. That's a very specific, we know this is illegal, but we know that we can get away with it. Bombing is starting to be reported from various and other the more remote villages within Rajampat. We haven't heard bombs in really in a decade, but it's happening again because they know that they can get away with it. And this is a real serious concern right now. And the remaining dive resorts that are still open, at least with their skeleton staff, along with the homestays and some of the dive guides in Rajampat, are now actually talking about forming their own patrols to at least push these bad guy fishing boats off of the dive sites, because otherwise we're going to come back in another 6 months, and the biomass buildup you've had on those reefs that have taken 15 years of protection to get to where they are is going to be back to what it was in the early 2000s. And it's heartbreaking to see this possibility, really.
It is scary, very scary. And I
Yeah.
guess that's probably not just happening in Indonesia, but I guess you've got connections throughout, Oceania area, places like Fiji and things like that. Is that happening there as well?
So I've been hearing more about the first situation I talked about, what you were talking about in Sanur, where you just have communities that were involved in tourism and now they're having to fish on the reefs and things. I haven't heard so much the active poaching situation, but it is, I am hearing about that in terrestrial protected areas throughout Asia and Africa,
Okay.
where that's now happening. And I haven't yet heard about what's going on with the elephants and the gorillas, but for instance, in Cambodia, there's a massive push into poaching in the big terrestrial protected areas there because there's no patrols,
Right.
and the bad guys know that, right? And
Yeah.
I'm just concerned that we're going to see an enormous overall loss of important biomass during this time. We have to get tourism going again. We just have to.
Yeah. So while governments right now around the world they are thinking about how to cope with this virus, they're not really like thinking about what are the consequences, let's say in the long term. Most probably, I can see, you know, like for instance now that in Jakarta the numbers of viruses infection are going up, and I can see probably the main government here being very focused on the situation in Java and Jakarta, and not maybe pay attention to their natural resources that they have around here. Do you also see some illegal fishing? Also, maybe did you hear a story of maybe some other countries coming in into Indonesia? For instance, when Ibu Suzy was the fishery minister, she did a great job to really push that out. And then, did you hear maybe some illegal fishing coming from other country into Indonesia too?
Well, I have been hearing a lot about Chinese vessels coming into the South China Sea parts of Indonesia, in particularly in Nambas and Natuna archipelagos. I don't know that that's necessarily COVID related. It just simply because
The change.
Ibu Suzy, yeah, Ibu Suzy's rough and tough approach is longer in place, and so I think that and it's fascinating to me to see how quickly you can see a change like that. Basically, those that do this hardcore fishing, they're not naive. They know exactly what the situation is, and the minute that they reckon that there's not going to be any, pushback, that they're on it.
They're right
Yep.
there. Exactly.
Show any sign of weakness.
It becomes a candy store for them.
What was interesting is what you mentioned about the terrestrial stuff. What I read last week was that they were shutting down tourism into the lowland gorillas there in Africa to protect them against the virus. But I wonder now, because they're doing that, are they still running patrols because there's no tourism there? And are they now being open to poachers again? That's, again, something you wouldn't think about. They're shutting it down to protect the gorillas, but does that open them up to poachers? That's a good question.
It's a very scary question.
Yeah.
I certainly hope they're keeping that in mind.
Yeah.
That's nature. That's the probably is the biggest impact that we are going to have as a consequence of this virus is really like the potential loss of species out there during this hard time. There is also like a concern of, for instance, there has been so much campaign and working about single-use plastic polluting the environments and oceans like that. And right now that we go into, let's say, this very strong and hygiene situation, we use single-use gloves, single-use masks, like that. Where are all these going? Eventually, we might have a repercussion already in developing countries that go into the ocean. It's one.
And I think the scary thing about that is okay, on the one hand, you've got all the personal protective equipment, which is all single-use and doing that. But at the same time, I've actually seen some, in my opinion, just horrific reports of basically the plastic bag lobby, right? The plastics industry pushing hard back against all of the single-use bans, saying, hey, you don't want people going around with their, reusable shopping bags because that could have COVID on it.
Exactly.
And so again, it's a situation where what I'm going to term the bad guys are absolutely taking advantage of the situation. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's very concerning, to say the least.
Special interest groups.
And also being now in a position where we are all the good guys are in lockdown. Yeah, we feel even, let's say, powerless to go out there and do something. Is there any, so you have few projects going on, and you have like also local teams here in Indonesia, like anyone, all the projects. What's the status with those projects? Like, are people still moving around in Indonesia, or?
They were until quite recently, but as Indonesian government has gotten more and more concerned about this, and there's been more and more shutdowns, which you obviously know more than I do about. I know that within Papua, as an example, the concern at the community level has suddenly started to really peak. And in my opinion, quite frankly, it's irresponsible journalism, which is really creating an enormous panic about something which really isn't probably much of a threat to them in the first place. But they're at the point now where our staff can't go into the communities anymore because communities don't want anyone from the outside.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just against foreigners. I'm talking about Indonesians coming into
Yep.
these villages. We even had a report from this morning of the patrol team lead from the Fam Islands MPA in Raja Ampat went to Waisai to collect fuel for the patrol because they're still actively patrolling right now. And upon returning to the village, he basically was being kind of shamed because the village said, "Hey, you went into Waisai. It's probably a nest of
It's
COVID, and
infected.
Wow.
you might be back." And now he's not able to get people onto the patrol boat with him because they think he's infected.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
you're kidding.
Yeah.
this is a real serious concern, and
But that's not only in Papua. This is happening everywhere.
I'm sure.
As a humanity, we say, "Oh, let's come back as a better human beings." Means like we're gonna lose all our social instinct, like a social behavior. We are social animals, and basically, we are saying right now, don't do social thing. Stay on your side. Keep the distance. So the first time that we met, when, like you said, by also like when we get bombarded by this media coverage and so on, where we always sort of scrap the surface of things. We never go deep into the numbers and understanding what actually is happening there. We just say like, oh, this many people are dying and this many people are infected. We never go too much into, let's say, the recovery sides of things, or what sort of infection people have. But what I wanted to say is that when we were fully into that, the first time that I personally met somebody from outside, I was like, and that was my friend coming to my house to pick up something, like, and I was like, oh, you need to stay at 1.5 meters from me. I went through that already. I pushed through that. But now imagine like the world humanity that is locked down, and the first step they take outside the house after all this trauma, we will be psychologically into deep trouble because of this.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, again, I'm probably opening myself up for all kinds of criticism for saying this, but it's so ironic, really, when you think about a place like Papua, where malaria is a serious killer there, right? As it is across the developing tropics. Malaria kills infinitely more people than COVID ever will, right? And yet, this has become the thing that we're terrified of. And again, with 100% respect to those that have lost loved ones in this COVID thing. The reality is, there are many other diseases and causes of death on the planet, which, when you add them up, really make COVID look not that significant in the big picture of human population demography.
Yeah, but right now it's got the spotlight.
It has a big spotlight, and
Yes.
it's causing a response unlike kind of anything I've seen in my lifetime, quite frankly.
For sure.
Exactly. Well,
now if this wasn't happening, if like we've got the, as you're saying, the poaching and things like that that's going on now, if that wasn't happening, if everyone was respecting it, and the coral reef, say in a place like, I don't know, say in a place like Misul or Fam or Penamu, any of that area, where you've got these beautiful hard coral gardens that do get damaged by heavy traffic, heavy diver traffic, but minimal damage, but some damage from divers. And say something like this lasted 6 months, where you didn't have anyone diving on a site in 6 months. How much would it improve the coral, like a 6-month break? Would you see that much of a difference in a place that's damaged?
I believe you I believe you absolutely would. If you look at the textbooks, what that will tell you about coral growth, you'll typically see, figures which suggest that the big brain corals might grow a couple of millimeters a year, whereas the branching corals, the acroporids, would grow kind of typically 10 to 15 centimeters a year at most. We know for a fact that in Indonesia, actually those growth rates can be much higher, and in particular from places where you've had volcanic flows that
Right.
have covered the reef, and then you come back 2 years later and you have something which is already a meter across that's grown back on bare lava. So we know that coral can grow a lot faster in Indonesia than it does in the
Mm.
textbooks. I have no doubt that if it would have probably for the benthic life, other than
Yep.
if we're getting bomb fishing,
Yeah.
this is probably a good break. This is probably a very good break for it. Um, and even actually for some of the bigger animals,
Yeah.
I think that if I think about probably the overall decrease in the amount of boat traffic, not just within the Indonesian archipelago, but probably globally, think about how nice that must be for the whales and the cetaceans, which are otherwise being drowned out by all this marine noise, and now they're probably quite happy that way. I do know also that in the first couple of weeks after the tourism shut down in Raja Ampat, I was hearing from some of my resort owner friends that they were just going out in the afternoon and having a snorkel, and they were amazed at the number of sharks and bigger fish that were now up on the reef top,
Yes,
Oh
they
wow.
come
which
shallower.
I think without question, when you've got a lot of bubble makers in the water, some of those bigger fishes will tend to be a little bit deeper. And so when there's nobody in the water, they're coming up, and who knows, maybe they were having more effective spawning or something going on as well.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes,
So there,
like
there was this initial nice.
we saw those
Go ahead.
panda in the zoo that was going viral, that they didn't mate
Yeah.
for 10 years, and as soon as the zoo closed down and there were no guests anymore, they start to mate.
Yeah.
You know. So for sure
Exactly.
something. I was noticing that a lot when I was working in Red Sea. That was one of the mass tourism places, and there is this beautiful reef called Shark and Yolanda Reef in Sharm el Sheikh in the tip, and we used to go there and always see the fish out in the blue. But when we started to go there like very early, if I could be the first boat there, all the shark action, all the fish action was right by the reef. So it was very very noticeable how the impact from tourism. So definitely, like, say once we come out from this, like we need to learn a few lessons, and we could see that there is a quick improvement in nature if you leave it alone. So maybe we can sort of regulate it a little bit more, that it doesn't go like excessively impacting
Yeah.
those areas. Give a little bit more, something similar to what the guys in Missoula are doing, like creating slots of times for certain area, live area, rather than just let it a wild west. For sure, that's
Yeah.
one thing. So what will be the first thing once we are all out and you're ready to travel and the country is open? So right now, after this crisis, what would be the first plan of action that you have in mind? You must have been thinking about that now for a bit.
Yeah. I think that the one thing which I'm most interested to do is to actually get back to Rajampat with our monitoring team and basically do the rounds, get in the water and see what we see on all of these reefs. Because obviously it's going to take a while for tourism to come back.
Yeah.
And if we've effectively stopped this poaching, which we are doing our utmost right now to channel emergency funds in, and it seems to me all the stakeholders there are doing their best right now to try to prevent further poaching. If we're able to do that, I think that we might actually see a positive thing there. But so we're very keen to basically do a reconnaissance and get a feel for what the situation is. That's definitely thing number one that we're going to do. The other thing, we're going to do everything we can to really promote the return of tourism as rapidly as possible.
Yeah.
I think that if it's not evident, I would simply note that the management of Raja Ampat's MPAs is very much dependent upon tourism revenues, right? So the environmental services fee that every single guest pays when they come in there, that is what pays for the management. It's what pays for the patrols. And so right now we're in a very difficult situation where the tourism revenues have disappeared and the MPA Management Authority and the patrols are left with no source of revenue. So we've had the Walton Family Foundation has been very generous in making a emergency grant.
That's good.
Approved on Friday of last week, and we're going to channel that to the patrol system. But we've got to get the tourism dollars flowing back in. I would also note something which is perhaps not evident, is that for almost all conservation organizations around the world, we're dependent very much on donor funding. You'd be amazed to see how many of, especially the private donors, you know, their portfolios have been demolished in this situation. And they're very, very hesitant to make any commitments of funding to conservation organizations when there's so much economic uncertainty. So we've seen a dramatic drop off in donor willingness to give right now,
Yeah.
which I
Mhm.
would hope would return. But at the very least, we've got to get the tourists coming back. It's just super important.
All right.
You can look at just the price of oil in the last few days. I'm sure it takes
Mm.
puts the fear into a lot of the major donors, things like that.
And do you have, let's say, any advice for us, not on a tourism side, like, is there anywhere that, for instance, let's say people like us in here could help you with something? Is there something that we could do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to imagine that when we come out of this and you're able to move again, that there is going to be this lag before you start getting large number of tourists back. And during that time frame, to the extent that professionals such as yourself can do exactly what I was just talking about, get out there and scope it a
Yeah.
bit, and let's get some idea of what we've got here, because there very likely could be some areas that need some serious emergency help,
Yeah.
and then
Yep.
there's others which maybe have actually thrived in this situation. So I think it's really important to. I'm sure that it will be patchy. It's going to be different from place to place.
Hmm.
Therefore, it would be very useful, I think, to have some idea of that, and also just simply to communicate to the government, the Indonesian government, so they're aware of what issues have really arisen during this time.
Yes.
Because I guess something like places like Komodo, that would be more of a national government funded national
Mm-hmm.
park,
Yep.
whereas Raja
Yep.
is more of a locally funded, as you say, through the tourism. Um, any idea if Komodo, if they're still patrolling or if they're having issues with government funding as well at the moment? I wonder.
That's a really great question, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. As you're probably aware, there aren't any really big NGOs focused
Hmm.
in Komodo anymore, and I just don't have a contact there. I'm not sure. Maybe that's someone else that
Right.
y'all can
Yeah.
pull
Yeah.
somebody else here to podcast and discuss. In theory, as you say, Mike, that patrol system and that management authority for Komodo is nationally funded, and is not necessarily reliant upon tourism dollars. So it would be in the future.
Right.
Typically, what they bring in this year has something to do with their budgetary allocation the next year. But right now, they should have funding, but
Hmm.
Yeah. You never know. It's
Do
such
you,
a
sheltered in.
do you think, Mark? Now I'm thinking out loud and live, so maybe I shouldn't do this. But do you think, like, it would be possible, for instance, to create a central hub of information for people like us in the private sector to funnel in all the information that we have about the site? It could be a good idea, like one area, and say, I'm in Komodo, I'm a dive resort operating over there, I noticed this, here are pictures, here is video,
Yeah,
something
absolutely.
like this. And maybe we could create something better that we didn't really have, which is like having the private sector more involved into,
Yeah.
let's say, patrolling or something like that, with just videos and things, and say, like, back up the
Yeah.
the, the voice.
I think it's a wonderful idea, and potentially something that you could use your contacts right now to
Mm,
start pushing on. Because I think, at least from what I can see in Raja Ampat, most of the resorts still, the owners are there, and the skeleton staff at least are there. So they can give a real time update as to what they're seeing. So
correct.
I think that could be a very useful thing, to be able to share with the Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, as well as governors and bupatis and so forth, because when this ends, those are potentially very long-term economic assets that they're
yep.
going to hope that those reefs still have something to offer. So
Yes.
I think it's very, very important that they know if there's a threat to them right now. Yeah.
For sure. What's also interesting is it's going to take different times, I think, for different areas of Indonesia to open up. So right now,
Hmm.
like everybody will come back to Bali and things like that fairly quickly. But I think there's a certain, like Eastern Indonesia closed itself off pretty quick, not just from tourists, but also from the rest of Indonesia. They said, okay, we don't want any flights. I think Papua, there's no flights going on at all at the moment. I think you're going to find that it'll open up much quicker, say Bali and Java, than it will over there. So it's going to be a very slow step-by-step process of which areas we can actually even get to. Who knows how long it's going to take?
Exactly.
A little scary.
And tell us, looks like that your country where you are in now, New Zealand, is the one mostly praised in the world as the strongest action, the greatest social distances like this. What are the news of comfort that you get during these times from your local there?
The comforting news that I get, is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
yeah.
You know, I think it's interesting. New Zealand certainly benefits from the fact that it's a remote island nation that can shut down its borders. And I would give a tremendous amount of praise. I think it's very well deserved to the New Zealand government for their daily briefings. You know, the Prime Minister comes on every single day and gives us an update. And encourages us to you know, she's just fantastic, and her messages are always about being kind to one another and so forth. So it's very good. At the same time, you know, there's some serious debate going on in the country about is this level of lockdown actually justified by the threat, right?
Hmm.
And you know, I saw a philosopher do a front page article in the New Zealand Herald the other day, which I tended to believe or agree very much with. And he said, look, no one wants to say this, but the reality is COVID largely affects those that are in the latter autumn years of their life. Whereas this shutdown is going to very much, in a biased way, be hurting students and younger people. And so we have to actually sit and think for a minute about which one are we prioritizing? Because and maybe you don't need to prioritize. Maybe you can save both.
Yeah,
But
we can address both differently.
our current approach is very much favoring in favor of those that are, you know, elderly and really threatened from this, and and it's hurting those that are younger, quite frankly. You know, I mean, online education, no matter what you say, is never going to be as good as real education live. And so there's a robust debate that's going on right now in New Zealand. Again, I praise the government for its openness, its transparency, and the continuous discussions going on. But there's a strong push right now to reopen the economy, and we are in next week we're going to be opening back up, and hopefully they're going to allow us back in the water soon. That's what I'm most.
Can you hear us?
You hear us now?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it going to be a full opening next week, like back to normal, or airports are still closed and all that?
Yeah, so we have the government has created a 4 levels of response. We have been in full level 4 lockdown, and on Tuesday we go to level 3, which allows significantly more business activity to go on, but you
Okay.
still have the social distancing. And in terms of the border restrictions are still very much in place.
That's
So
good.
we'll have to win those. Well, it's good, but then it's bad in the sense that tourism isn't going to happen.
Right.
So we'll see.
Yeah, because it's going to be interesting in a place like New Zealand where they've cut everything off. Once they do open it again, you're going to have a fresh wave. Possible carriers bring it in, and then does it just prolong the shutdown? Who knows?
Yeah.
Very
Well,
interesting
I think
times.
that the government of New Zealand is very committed to not having that happen. They don't want any second wave. They
Right.
don't want yo-yo. So they've basically said we envision getting more or less back to normal domestically relatively soon. But in terms of the border restrictions, you know, right now they're talking about the possibility of a trans-Tasman bubble whereby Australia and New Zealand are freely connected, but only Australia and New Zealand
Wow.
and the rest of the world. They don't want to have a second wave, so to speak. So yeah,
So you
it could
couldn't
be a
even
long.
go. You couldn't even fly out to Indonesia if you wanted to, once it opens up.
Well, once it opens, if there are still flights out, I potentially could leave. But when I would come back, I would be forced into a mandatory 2-week quarantine in a government facility.
Right.
Yeah.
And they might very well be making it so that they don't, obviously that's on the taxpayer dollar. So I think that they might strongly restrict that as well. So I'm
Right.
not sure.
Yeah, interesting times, that's for sure. Makes it tough for someone like yourself to do your work.
Mm, mm.
Getting itchy feet.
And dried out gills.
Do you actually dive much when you're like, if you could get in the water right now, is there something you would do more than just a fun dive? Could you do research there or no?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. I actually I had pretty extensive manta ray tagging work planned for March and early April, and that of course has all been thrown out.
But in New Zealand?
In New Zealand,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
We have oceanic mantas here, and they're
Gotcha.
basically unknown as to what they do.
Oh.
And the one tag that we got out last summer, the animal almost immediately swam all the way to Fiji.
Oh, wow.
So we have an interesting manta ray population here that we're very keen to explore. And yeah, unfortunately, it looks like we have to wait till next summer again.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is actually a beautiful time of the year for diving in New Zealand. It's clear
Mhm.
water, a lot of fish around, and yeah, can't get in the water yet.
But cold, 17
Yeah.
degrees or so, I guess.
Well, we're at the end of summer, so it's actually 24 and
Okay.
it's coming down.
That's all right. I would still freeze. I did one dive in New Zealand years ago for living in Tahiti. Went on holiday in New Zealand, jumped in the water once and paid for 2 dives, did one. I was like, nope, that's enough of that. Too cold.
Yep, yep. I have a dry suit now, so
A smart move.
I'm
Smart move.
here.
And would the mantis be North Island or South Island? Or it's a secret?
No, it's North Island.
Okay.
100% North Island.
Is that where Poor Nights is?
Yeah, I guess up that way.
Yep.
And then you've got the resident orcas around as well. That would be quite cool.
Yeah, oh, fantastic.
Yeah, you have a good
Opposite.
playground over there, but we need to
You
open
need to be-
again.
you need to be able to play with it.
Let's go. Right, but I see like what's happening in Italy and probably everywhere else, like Italy, where some of the first one to get locked down. I think that people are getting tired to stay home. So eventually we'll have to be done something, like we cannot stay home
Yep.
forever, and we just need to start to focus maybe to see to a different approach than what we've
It's
taken.
this interesting four-tiered approach could be the way.
Exactly. We'll see.
We'll see.
Right. So
Yeah.
I think we got some very good insights and things that we can actually all tell to each other. Is like what I take away from here. We cannot really lower our guard and thinking about that the nature is thriving during this time. There are many concerns and there are many bad peoples out there that they take advantages of situation like this. So
for sure.
and maybe we can start to get involved to create that sort of
Awareness about it.
awareness. Like it wouldn't take much, like even like a simple Facebook page or group, out there where guys, everyone, if you see things around, post it over there, and then all of a sudden you start to have you start to show those people, those bad people, that there are eyes on them, but we need to get out there again. That's for sure. First, they need to cut the restriction of the ocean. I'm sure we can keep some very good social distances. Even before tourism comes in here, I could go diving without infect anyone, like keeping my distance from my body and so on.
Yeah. Indeed.
So, and actually this helped, like having him beside here and not being completely cut out. Okay, be married, you have your family around, but try to think, like all those guys that maybe are by themselves, during this time. It's psychologically, it's a big burden, so. Meeting Mike every once in a while, even if his mic is great,
Yeah. There you go.
All right, thanks, Mark. Thanks a lot for this conversation, and hopefully we're gonna chat again in the future, and when things have changed and developed a little bit, to see some progress on this.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right,
Good luck
thank
with
you.
the
Say hi to the